The small town of Pine Grove had never seen anything quite like it. When word spread about the engagement between the town's newest doctor and the son of its most prominent family, it felt like time stood still. You see, love stories happen every day, but this one was different. Dr. Rose Chen walked into Pine Grove Memorial Hospital 2 years ago, bringing with her a fresh perspective and exceptional skills in heart surgery. She wasn't just any doctor, she was the kind who remembered every patient's name, who stayed late to hold worried family members' hands, and whose gentle smile could ease the worst fears. The community quickly grew to love her, even if some older folks raised their eyebrows at her modern approaches to medicine. Then there was David White, whose family name graced half the buildings in town. The Whites had been in Pine Grove since before it was even called Pine Grove. They owned the biggest real estate company in 3 counties, and everyone knew that crossing paths with a White meant you were dealing with old money and older traditions. David wasn't like the rest of his family, though. While they spent their days in country club meetings and charity galas, he devoted his time to running the local community center. That's where he first met Rose. She had volunteered to give free health checkups to elderly residents who couldn't afford regular doctor visits. He was immediately struck by her dedication, watching as she spent extra time with each patient, explaining everything in ways they could understand. Their love story began over paper cups of terrible coffee in the community center's break room. They shared stories about their dreams, her vision for bringing advanced medical care to small towns like Pine Grove, his plans to expand the center's services to help more people. They laughed about their cultural differences, with Rose teaching David how to use chopsticks and him introducing her to his grandmother's secret recipe for sweet tea. But when David finally worked up the courage to tell his family about Rose, the warmth of their romance met the cold reality of small-town prejudices. His mother, Eleanor, nearly dropped her prized crystal teacup. His father, Richard, stood up from his leather armchair and walked out of the room without a word. His sisters exchanged looks that spoke volumes about their disapproval. "You can't be serious," his mother finally said, her voice trembling. "What about Rachel from the country club? Her father's on the hospital board, you know. She's such a lovely girl, and her family, well, they're more our kind." David stood his ground. "Mom, Rose is brilliant, kind, and she saves lives every day. She's exactly our kind, the kind of person who makes this world better." The news spread through Pine Grove like wildfire. At the grocery store, conversations would stop when either of them walked in. At church, people who used to greet David warmly suddenly found the hymn books fascinating when he passed by. Even some of Rose's patients, who had sung her praises just weeks before, started requesting other doctors. But here's the thing about love. Real love doesn't back down when things get tough. Instead of letting the whispers and stares tear them apart, Rose and David grew stronger. They started having dinner at the local diner, right in the front window where everyone could see them. They held hands while walking through the town square, their laughter echoing off the old brick buildings. Their happiness seemed to confuse those who opposed them the most. How could they smile so freely when faced with such disapproval? How could they remain so kind to people who showed them nothing but coldness? As the couple began planning their wedding, they knew they were in for a battle. But they had each other, and sometimes that's all you really need to change the world, or at least a small town in need of an awakening. The storm hit hardest within the White family's grand Victorian home on Hill Street. The day after David and Rose announced their engagement, Eleanor White called an emergency family meeting. The house that had witnessed generations of White family gatherings now felt more like a war room. Richard White sat in his usual spot, puffing on his pipe, even though he'd supposedly quit years ago. David's sisters, Patricia and Linda, perched on the edge of the antique sofa their mother had always forbidden them to sit on as children. The only person missing was Tommy, David's younger brother, who was probably still at his law office downtown. "This is a disaster," Eleanor declared, pacing across the Persian rug she'd inherited from her grandmother. Her perfectly manicured hands shook as she clutched her phone. "I've already received dozens of messages. The hospital board members' wives are asking questions. The country club is buzzing with gossip." Patricia, ever the practical one, jumped in. "Have you thought about what this will do to the family business? Half our clients are old money families who've worked with us for generations." "They're not exactly." She paused, searching for the right words. open to change. Change? Linda scoffed. This isn't about change. This is about David throwing away everything our family has built. And for what? Some doctor who just showed up out of nowhere? David stood by the fireplace, his hands gripping the mantel so tight his knuckles turned white. Rose didn't come from nowhere. She graduated top of her class at Stanford Medical School. She turned down offers from major hospitals to work here because she wanted to help communities that need good doctors. Oh, how noble, Linda rolled her eyes. I'm sure it has nothing to do with finding a wealthy husband in a small town. That's when David's voice changed, becoming quiet but sharp as steel. Rose makes 3 times what I do at the community center. She drives a 10-year-old car because she puts most of her money into a free clinic she's starting. But you wouldn't know that because none of you have bothered to even meet her. The room fell silent except for the ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner. It was the same clock that had counted the minutes through every major white family decision for the past 50 years. Now it counted the seconds until Richard finally spoke. Son, he said, his voice heavy with false patience, you need to understand your position in this community. The white name means something here. We have responsibilities, traditions. Traditions? David cut in. Like when great-grandfather refused to sell houses to certain families. Those kinds of traditions. Elena gasped. We don't talk about those times. Things were different then. They're different now too, Mom, or at least they should be. The argument might have continued, but the front door opened and closed with a bang. Tommy walked in, his tie loosened and his lawyer's briefcase in hand. He took one look at the family tableau and let out a low whistle. Well, if it isn't the Spanish Inquisition, he said, dropping into an armchair. I just had lunch with Rose, by the way. She showed me pictures of the kids at the community center. Did you know she's teaching them basic first aid? The room erupted again, this time with Eleanor turning on her younger son. You had lunch with her? Without telling me. Tommy shrugged. Last I checked, I was allowed to have lunch with my future sister-in-law. Those words, future sister-in-law, seemed to echo through the house. Elena sank into her chair, looking suddenly older. Richard's pipe had gone out. The sisters exchanged glances, this time uncertain rather than condemning. David looked at his brother with gratitude, but Tommy wasn't done. You know what's really going to shame this family? Not David marrying the most talented doctor this town has ever seen. It's going to be how people remember how we acted right now, in this moment. The grandfather clock kept ticking, counting down to a wedding that would either tear the family apart or force them to grow in ways they never expected. Outside, the town kept buzzing with gossip, but inside that house, something had shifted. It wasn't acceptance, not yet, but it was the first crack in a wall that had stood for generations. Pine Grove was a town divided. The engagement of Dr. Rose Chen and David White had drawn an invisible line through the community, and everyone seemed to be choosing sides. The Pine Grove Country Club, which had stood proudly on its hilltop perch for over a century, became ground zero for the conflict. Mrs. Henderson, the club's event coordinator for 20 years, found herself in an awkward position one sunny morning. Rose and David sat across from her desk, asking about wedding venue availability. She kept shuffling through her booking calendar, avoiding their eyes. I'm so sorry, she mumbled, but we're fully booked for the next, 2 years. Her cheeks flushed as she spoke the obvious lie. Everyone knew the club never booked more than 18 months in advance. David, who'd attended countless events there since childhood, simply nodded. Interesting. Even the October 15th date, that's when my sister Patricia had tentatively held her garden party. Mrs. Henderson's flush deepened. She'd known the Whites her entire life, had watched David grow up. Now she couldn't even look him in the eye. But while some doors closed, others unexpectedly opened. That same afternoon, Rose was treating Mr. Chen, no relation, at the hospital for his chronic heart condition. His daughter Jenny, who ran the popular Golden Dragon restaurant downtown, overheard Rose telling a nurse about the country club's scheduling conflict. Dr. Chen, Jenny called out as Rose was leaving, my uncle owns the Riverview Gardens. It's even prettier than that stuffy old country club. You should come see it. Word spread quickly through the town's Asian community, many of whom had been Rose's patients. Then something remarkable happened. People started talking across the usual social boundaries that had divided Pine Grove for generations. Mrs. Washington, whose grandson Rose had saved after a terrible car accident, marched into her bridge club meeting at the Methodist Church and declared, "That doctor saved my Tommy's life. I don't care what color she is or where she came from. She's an angel, and shame on anyone who says different." The owner of Joe's Diner, where Rose and David often had their lunch dates, started refusing service to people who spoke ill of the couple. "My place, my rules," he'd say gruffly. "Don't like it? Betty's Cafe is right down the street." But not everyone was supportive. The hospital board called an emergency meeting, supposedly to discuss budget issues. Really, they wanted to talk about the situation. Some board members worried about donors pulling their support. Others claimed patient confidence might be affected. Dr. Miller, the chief of surgery, finally stood up. "Dr. Chen has the highest patient satisfaction rates in the hospital's history. Her surgical success rates are well above national averages. If anyone pulls their support because of who she marries, maybe we should question their priorities, not her choices." The town's annual summer festival became another battlefield. Rose had volunteered to run the first aid tent, as she had the previous year. Some committee members suggested that given the circumstances, maybe she should step back. That's when the high school football team, led by their captain whose little sister had been Rose's patient, announced they would boycott the festival if she wasn't allowed to volunteer. "She fixed my sister's heart," the captain told the local newspaper. "Who cares who she's marrying? She makes our town better." Even the local paper found itself caught in the controversy. The editor, an old-school journalist who'd covered Pine Grove news for 40 years, received dozens of letters demanding he take a stand one way or the other. Instead, he published a front-page story about Rose's work at the free clinic and her efforts to bring specialized medical care to their rural community. The story ran alongside a photo of her teaching CPR to a group of elementary school students. No mention was made of the engagement or the controversy, just the facts about a doctor serving her community. Through it all, Rose and David continued their daily lives. They ate at Joe's Diner, volunteered at the community center, and planned their wedding. Rose kept saving lives, treating everyone who came through her door with the same care and respect, regardless of their stance on her engagement. David expanded the community center's programs, including a new health education initiative that Rose helped design. Their love story was changing Pine Grove, forcing people to confront their prejudices and choose what kind of community they wanted to be. Some chose to cling to the old ways, but others began to see that change wasn't something to fear. It was something that could make their town stronger, better, and more truly united than ever before. The wedding planning started in the midst of the town's divided opinions. Rose and David found themselves in Mrs. Lee's bridal shop one Saturday morning, where an unexpected encounter changed everything. Mrs. Lee, a woman in her 70s who had dressed 3 generations of Pine Grove brides, initially seemed hesitant when they walked in. "I heard you were looking for a dress," she said quietly to Rose, her hands fidgeting with her measuring tape. Then she paused, looking at Rose's face properly for the first time. "Wait, are you the doctor who treated my grandson last winter? The one with pneumonia?" Rose nodded, remembering the frightened little boy who'd spent 3 nights in the hospital. Mrs. Lee's eyes welled up with tears. "You sat with him all night when his fever wouldn't break. You sang to him in Chinese when he was scared." Without another word, Mrs. Lee locked the shop's front door and flipped the sign to closed. "Today," she announced, "we find you the perfect dress. My other appointments can wait." The dress search became more than just finding the right gown. As Mrs. Lee worked, she shared stories about Pine Grove's history, including her own marriage 40 years ago, when some people hadn't been too kind to a Korean woman marrying a local boy. "But look at us now," she said, pinning up the dress's hem. "My shop dresses all their granddaughters." Meanwhile, David faced his own challenges at Riverview Gardens, where they decided to hold the ceremony. The venue's owner, Mr. Wilson, was giving them a tour when a group of David's father's friends happened to be playing golf nearby. "You're really going through with this?" one called out, loud enough for everyone to hear. "What would your grandfather say?" Mr. Wilson, who had been quietly showing them the garden's features, suddenly straightened his back. "I knew David's grandfather," he said, his voice carrying across the lawn. Frank White gave me my first job when no other business in town would hire a black groundskeeper. He told me to ignore the talk and do good work. That's exactly what I did, and now I own this place." The wedding preparations continued, bringing out both the best and worst in people. When the first florist refused their business, the owner of the local grocery store, whose wife Rose had diagnosed with early-stage breast cancer, offered to order whatever flowers they wanted through his suppliers. The community center's cooking class volunteered to cater the reception, turning it into a beautiful blend of American and Chinese cuisine. The elderly ladies Rose had treated at the free clinic insisted on teaching the cooking class their best recipes, creating an unexpected fusion of flavors that represented their growing community. Tommy, David's younger brother, took charge of the guest list, a task that became increasingly complex. "The Robertsons say they won't come if the Chens are invited," he told David one evening. "And the hospital board chairman is still deciding." David looked at the list and picked up a pen. "Then cross off the Robertsons. We're not playing that game. This wedding isn't about who has the most social influence in Pine Grove. It's about celebrating love with people who actually care about us." Rose found unexpected allies in her hospital colleagues. The nursing staff organized a surprise bridal shower in the break room, decorating it with paper lanterns and hearts made from surgical gloves. Dr. Miller, the chief of surgery, presented her with a gift, a photo album filled with pictures of all the lives she'd saved over the past 2 years. "This is your real family in Pine Grove," he said, pointing to the photos of smiling patients. "And we're all proud to stand with you." As the wedding date approached, the town's attention shifted from the controversy to the actual preparations. People began to see it less as a statement and more as a celebration of two people they knew and respected. The local bakery created a cake that combined Western and Eastern designs. The high school art class painted signs in both English and Chinese to welcome guests. Even those who had initially opposed the union found it harder to maintain their stance as they watched the community come together. The wedding was becoming a reflection of what Pine Grove could be, not just a town stuck in its ways, but a place where tradition and change could coexist, where love could bridge any divide. The morning of the wedding dawned bright and clear at Riverview Gardens. The autumn air carried the sweet scent of late-blooming flowers, and leaves in shades of gold and red created a natural carpet along the garden paths. Everything was perfect, except for one detail that couldn't be ignored: the empty seats in the front row. The White family's designated chairs sat vacant, their white ribbons fluttering in the morning breeze. Only Tommy's seat would be filled. He arrived early, helping to straighten rows of chairs and adjust the flower arrangements. His eyes kept drifting to those empty spaces, each one representing a family member who had chosen pride over love. In the bridal suite, Rose stood before a mirror, wearing the dress Mrs. Lee had altered to perfection. Her mother, who had flown in from California, carefully pinned a traditional Chinese hair ornament alongside the Western veil, a beautiful blend of both cultures. The room was filled with nurses from the hospital, all helping with last-minute details. "Your future in-laws might not be here," one of the nurses said gently, "but look how many people are." She pulled back the curtain, revealing the garden filling with guests. There was Mr. Chen in his wheelchair, accompanied by his daughter Jenny. Mrs. Washington had arrived early to get a good seat, wearing her Sunday best. The entire high school football team stood in their rented suits, looking both uncomfortable and proud. The local newspaper editor sat in the back, camera ready. Next to him was Mr. Wilson, the venue owner, who had personally overseen every detail of the garden's preparation. Even Mrs. Henderson from the country club had slipped in quietly, choosing conscience over convention. In the groom's room, David stood adjusting his tie when there was a knock at the door. It was Tommy, holding an envelope. "This just arrived from Dad's office," he said hesitantly. David took a deep breath before opening it, expecting another attempt to stop the wedding. Instead, he found a check, a substantial one, with a note that read simply, "For your community center's health program." No strings attached. As the ceremony time approached, something unexpected happened. People began moving the empty chairs away from the front row. Mrs. Lee stepped forward first, carrying her chair to the back. "These spaces should be filled with love," she announced. One by one, others followed. Patients Rose had treated, children from the community center, elderly folks from the free clinic. The front row was soon filled with faces of all colors and ages, each representing a life touched by the couple. The ceremony itself became a beautiful testament to change. The local minister shared duties with a Buddhist monk, honoring both families' traditions. The vows were spoken in English and Chinese, with Mrs. Lee's grandson helping to translate for some of the older guests. When David and Rose were pronounced husband and wife, the cheers that erupted weren't just for the couple, they were for every barrier broken, every prejudice challenged. At the reception, more surprises awaited. The hospital board chairman arrived, apologizing for his lateness and presenting a donation to the free clinic in honor of the couple. The high school football team had prepared a dance routine that mixed traditional Chinese moves they'd learned from YouTube with their own style, making everyone laugh and cheer. The empty chairs at the family table were quickly filled by others. Dr. Miller took the seat meant for David's father, Mrs. Washington sat in Eleanor's place, and Mr. Wilson occupied Richard's chair. It wasn't the family they had expected to celebrate with, but it was the family they had built through love, respect, and service to their community. As the evening drew to a close, Tommy stood to make his best man speech. He looked at the filled tables, the dancing couples, the mingling of cultures and generations. "Someone once told me that this wedding would shame our family," he said, his voice carrying across the garden. "Well, look around. I've never been more proud to be part of this family, this new, bigger, more beautiful family that my brother and sister-in-law have created. They've shown us that love doesn't divide people, fear does. And in Pine Grove, love is winning." 3 months after the wedding, fate decided to step in at Pine Grove Memorial Hospital's emergency room. It was just past midnight when Eleanor White clutched her chest in her kitchen, dropping her favorite teacup. The sound of shattering china brought Richard running downstairs to find his wife collapsed on the floor. The ambulance ride was a blur of sirens and fear. In the emergency room, the on-call doctor's face turned grave as he looked at Eleanor's test results. "She needs immediate surgery," he announced. "Her heart, it's serious." The hospital staff scrambled to call in their cardiac surgeon, but he was away at a conference. That's when a nurse whispered something to the emergency room doctor, who turned to Richard with an uncomfortable expression. "Sir, we do have one cardiothoracic surgeon available right now." Richard knew before the doctor finished his sentence. His daughter-in-law, Dr. Rose Chen White, was the only surgeon qualified to perform the procedure. The nurse found Rose in the doctor's lounge, having just finished a long shift. Without hesitation, she grabbed her scrubs and headed to the operating room, but stopped briefly to talk to Richard. "I know this is difficult," she said, looking straight into his eyes. "But I promise you, I will take care of her as if she were my own mother." Richard could only nod, words failing him as he watched the woman his family had rejected prepare to save his wife's life. In the waiting room, news spread quickly. Patricia and Linda arrived, their faces pale with worry. Tommy came straight from a late night at his law office, still in his suit. David rushed in last, having been at a community center event in the next town over. The hours ticked by slowly. Every time the operating room doors swung open, the family tensed, but it was never news about Eleanor. Richard paced the floor, wearing a path in the old linoleum. The same floor where he'd walked years ago when his children were born, where he'd waited during his own father's final hours. Around 4 a.m., one of the operating room nurses came out to give them an update. Dr. Chen White had to perform an additional bypass. "It's complicated, but she's handling it beautifully. Your wife is in excellent hands." Linda whispered to Patricia, "Remember how Mom said she'd never trust her with anything important?" Patricia just shook her head, tears in her eyes. Finally, just as the sun was rising, Rose emerged from the operating room. She looked exhausted but satisfied. "The surgery was successful," she announced, still in her surgical gown. "We had to do more than initially planned, but her heart is strong. She's a fighter." Richard stood up, his legs shaky. "Can I see her?" "Soon," Rose assured him. "She's in recovery now, but she's asking for you." As Rose turned to leave, Richard caught her arm. "Wait," he said, his voice rough with emotion. Thank you for saving her, for being here despite everything." Rose's expression softened. "Mr. White, when I took my medical oath, I promised to help anyone who needed me. That includes family, even family who haven't accepted me yet." The impact of her words hit everyone in the waiting room. This woman, whom they had judged and rejected, had just spent 6 hours meticulously repairing Eleanor's heart, giving their mother and wife a second chance at life. Later that morning, as Eleanor rested in intensive care, Richard sat beside her bed, holding her hand. Through the window, he could see Rose at the nurse's station, carefully reviewing post-operative care instructions. She'd stayed well past her shift to monitor Eleanor's recovery personally. "She's really something, isn't she?" Eleanor whispered weakly, following his gaze. "Our David, he chose well." Richard squeezed his wife's hand, thinking about all the time they'd wasted on pride and prejudice. "Yes," he replied, watching as Rose spoke kindly to a nervous young nurse. "Yes, he did." 1 year after the wedding, the White family gathered in David and Rose's backyard for a special dinner. The evening air was warm, and strings of lights twinkled overhead. The table was set with Eleanor's best china, the same set she'd once worried would never be used for family gatherings again. Eleanor sat at the head of the table, looking healthier than she had in years. Her surgery scar had faded, but the memory of that night remained clear in everyone's mind. She watched as Rose moved around the kitchen with David, preparing a meal that blended both their family recipes. The sight of her son teaching his father how to use chopsticks made her smile. "I was so wrong," Eleanor said softly to Tommy, who sat beside her. "I was afraid of losing our family traditions. Instead, we gained so many beautiful new ones." The past year had brought changes no one could have predicted. After Eleanor's recovery, Richard had shocked everyone by asking Rose to join the hospital board. "We need someone who actually remembers what it's like to treat patients," he'd said gruffly, trying to hide how proud he was of his daughter-in-law's reputation for excellence. Patricia and Linda had come around in their own ways. Patricia's real estate company now actively worked to help new doctors find homes in Pine Grove, regardless of their background. Linda had started volunteering at the community center's health education program, learning things about her own neighbors she'd never known before. The dinner table that evening was filled with dishes that told their family's new story. Eleanor's traditional pot roast sat next to Rose's mother's dumplings. The vegetables came from the community garden Rose and David had started behind the center. The dessert was Mrs. Lee's special recipe, which she'd insisted on teaching Eleanor during their weekly tea meetings. "Remember when you told me our family name meant something in this town?" David asked his father as they enjoyed the meal. "It means even more now." Richard nodded, looking around at his expanded family. "Your grandfather would have been proud," he said, "not just of the changes we've made, but of the way you fought for them." The conversation flowed easily now, so different from the tense silences of the past. They talked about the free clinic's success, about the new families moving to Pine Grove attracted by its growing reputation for excellent healthcare and community spirit. They laughed about the time Richard had tried to use Chinese phrases he'd learned from a phone app, completely confusing Rose's parents during their last visit. As the evening wound down, Eleanor stood up, tapping her glass for attention. Her hands shook slightly, not from illness anymore, but from emotion. "I want to make a toast," she said, looking directly at Rose. "To the daughter I almost lost before I had her. You didn't just save my life in that operating room, you saved our family's heart." Rose reached for David's hand under the table as Eleanor continued. "When I was recovering in the hospital, I watched how you treated everyone, from the janitor to the chief of staff, with the same respect. I saw how much your patients loved you, how the children's faces lit up when you visited the pediatric ward. And I realized that the very things we feared, change, difference, the unknown, were exactly what our family and this town needed." The toast was interrupted by the sound of a car pulling up. It was Mr. Wilson from Riverview Gardens, along with Mrs. Lee and several other members of the community who'd supported Rose and David from the beginning. They'd been invited for dessert. Another new tradition the White family had embraced. As the backyard filled with more guests, more laughter, and more love, Eleanor looked around at what her family had become. The empty chairs from that wedding day were now filled not just with family by blood, but family by choice. Their story had become legend in Pine Grove, a reminder that love could break down any barrier, heal any wound, and build bridges where walls once stood. "You know," Tommy said, helping to serve dessert to their guests, "someone should write this story down someday. People need to know that change is possible, that it's never too late to open your heart. Rose smiled, watching as her father-in-law proudly showed off pictures of the free clinic to their guests. "They'll know," she said softly. "They'll know because we'll keep living it, every single day."